Good afternoon. How many of you have considered growing, say, a soybean that's a full maturity group earlier than normal, or a corn that's perhaps 10 days earlier than normal? Anybody consider that? Can't see hands. Well, that's what essentially we've been thinking about and talking about here, and that's what Keith asked us to talk about. So Nathan covered the ideas on some soybeans, and I'm going to hit corn pretty hard here. I've got to say that Angela Bastidas, and by the way, Nathan, that was her MS work that you were talking about earlier. She's working on her PhD now, and I'm going to be presenting some of Angela's work here in a few minutes. And Chris Proctor is a extension weed educator that the three of us were riding in a pickup one time and back from Clay Center, where most of our work is done. And this whole concept came up, a pretty creative way to look at the impacts of hybrids and yields and cover crops simultaneously. And Kaylee is here, and she helped put this PowerPoint together. So she's sitting here in the audience as well. Oh, I put that light bulb up there to tell you that that's supposed to help you remember that slide is actually in your handout. All right. So that tells you that after 4 o'clock yesterday, some of these slides went into the presentation and are pretty fresh. So the ones with the light bulbs were in the handout, but the ones without were developed after 4 o'clock yesterday. How's that? So here's one that must be in your handout. And this comes from a crop production clinic a couple years ago, I guess it was last year, where we talk about different cropping systems for here in Nebraska and the ease of establishing cover crops in those systems, from very easy to very difficult or impossible. And this is just us sitting around a table with a cover crops group in Lincoln and across the state actually thinking about it. Most of the work that I'm involved in are right down here, and thanks to the soybean checkoff board and the corn checkoff board, they were curious and supported most of our research on how to establish cover crops in these systems without influencing corn and soybean yields. So that's a good share of our research is along those areas. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about a different study today. And the idea here, and Justin McMecken probably helped us put this visual together, and he's here as well today. How about using different corn planting dates and hybrid maturities to establish cover crops? So one way you could do that, so we're thinking out of the box a little bit here, is by delaying the planting of the primary crop, whether it's corn or soybeans. Get by with a shorter season variety. I think Nathan showed you that earlier, that we can sacrifice some yield a little bit by those late planting dates, and you can your harvest dates so would be very, it'd still be into this part of September, most likely, with those earlier maturing varieties. So this is research we would like to do. We haven't started doing that yet, but the work we are doing is planting cover crops after corn and using earlier season hybrids. So that's the data I'm going to show you here in a few minutes. Got a couple years of data on that. This one's in your handout. This comes from some work from Pioneer and a colleague at Kansas State, Dr. Chiampati. And it talks about grain yield here in megagrams. Now, I didn't have time to translate that into English units, but if you take that 10 line right across there, that's 160 bushels. And this is about slightly over 200 up here, like 213 at 12 tons per hectare. So 160 bushels there, over 200 there, and 18,000 up to 36,000 seeding rates. Over here you see that they've combined data from across the Corn Belt here, and Angela summarized this for us, with relative maturities greater than 115 days is that top line. The line right below it is the between 106 and 115, and literally those lines are on top of each other in terms of yield as well as response to plant population. So that's good to know. This came from Monsanto. Bruce Berger put this together in the last few days for me, so that you don't have this one. It's what you call very fresh data. And what they've done here, and there's 23,500 and some plots that went into this data set that Bruce put together, working with Monsanto. And the way you read this, it came through lighter here than I expected, but this is your zero line here. You can barely see that in terms of yield gain. The average yield or the average maturity for the state of Nebraska, so we're looking at the whole state now, and all their data from 3 years of work there is 110.5 maturity, relative maturity of corn hybrids. So the hybrids that were 110 to 110 and a half days, their yields are right here on this point. So if a hybrid yielded more than that, that was 110 day, would be up on this area of the graph, and if it yielded less, it'd be down in here. As you increase maturity by 5 days, so it'd be a 115-day hybrid, it shows you that those yields are maybe a couple bushels higher than normal. And if you drop down to 5 days earlier, so 105-day hybrid, your yields are probably another 2.5 to 3 bushels less. Do you see how that figure works? Now, the one downside of this graph is that the outliers really skew the results. And what you need to know, just focus on this part here because there's hundreds of samples in here, whereas when you get out to the outliers, there's only a handful. So I haven't balanced it for that data yet, or for that thinking yet. But basically, there's not a huge change in productivity with statewide here, with the hybrids ranging, say, between 107 or 8 and 112 to 13 or so. I think that's that's the take home there. Now let's zoom in on East Central Nebraska with data from the East Central Cropping District. And the average maturity here is 112 days, and you see really the same kind of trends. I've not shown these before. Do they make sense? Are you seeing the way you understand the data? So again, showing that there isn't a huge change if you stay within a handful of days on either side of what would be normal. Now the downside of this is that these locations probably had just, say if you get a northern location, it might be 105 to 110 day hybrids, and you go further south, it might be 110 to 115 day hybrids. In other words, not all the hybrids were at all locations. So our objective in our work was to look at the same hybrids at the same locations to see how they would respond. And here it says study 2 because study 1 is a study that Angela is working on where she's actually interseeding at corn planting time. She's also coming in at V6, V7, also at R5, R6, and after maturity. That's study 1. So stay tuned, you'll hear more about that sometime. But here's her objectives. We're looking at both the impact on the rotational crop. I won't be presenting that data today. We're looking at cover crop biomass, and we're looking at the effects of planting date and corn maturity and population. And this research was done at South Central Ag Lab near Clay Center and Harvard. And that's irrigated, rain-fed at Havelock, which is at 84th and Havelock, just on the east side of Lincoln. It's a creative design here, and I can go into that if you're really interested. That's where having Chris and Angela together and pick up with me, it was a pretty neat idea that we came up with. I was listening and taking notes. There's some more no-till standard fertilization program. Here are the hybrids that were used in the first year. They changed a bit in the second year. Down here, we tried to get all the genetics similar in terms of the genetically modified materials together. You'll see we have a range of hybrids from 80 to 115 day in both years. We did add a 99-day hybrid here in the second year and 105. So hybrids changed a bit between the 2 years. Don't worry about the heat units. Those are in Celsius, so that's in centigrade, so they're a little bit different than if we were working with the 50-degree heat unit system. So 7 or 8 different hybrids in both years. Basically, you've got this, but all it tells you is 2016 at Clay Center was warmer and drier than 15, so I'll pass through on that. If you look at yields here, this chart over here tells me what is important or significant. So the hybrids did differ in terms of yield. The relative maturity of the hybrids did differ. The year had an impact, so the hybrids didn't respond the same across years. And also the hybrids did not respond the same across planting dates. So we're gonna slice through that with you and show you what that means. So this chart here shows you the corn yield is affected by planting date and relative maturity. 80-day up to 115-day hybrids here. We had 2 planting dates. The blue column on your left of each pair is about the 1st of May in both years. And the second column, the one on the right, is about the middle of May. Not as good a spread as we wanted, but that's what happened. So to compare these then, you're looking at the highest yields occurring here at the 95-day hybrids. Similar yields in the early planting date for the 111 and the 115. They all have that A on top of them. Are you seeing that? And if you look at the later planting date, actually we started losing yield with the 111 and 115. Things looking pretty normal here for you? You okay? If you have questions, just raise your hand. I might be able to see you. So that's the effective planting date, and the hybrids did differ in terms of their response to the different planting dates. That's what that shows you. This next one shows you, and what I've done here is modified one that Angela had prepared, but I think you've got a similar version. This is year by relative maturity here, showing you that the 2015 data are on the left, 2016 on the right of each pair. And again, the highest yields with the 95-day hybrid. In 2015, it was similar for the 111 and the 115-day. But in 2016, those later maturing hybrids dropped off in yield. So here's another way to look at the data looking at the individual year of 2015. So the planting date by maturity was different like I showed you earlier. That was also true in 16. So both years, the planting date affected the hybrids differently. In the first year, we also had a population interaction with that. And I think this data here, this chart shows you that data. In terms of relative maturity, again, 80 to 115-day yields in bushels up here. Top yields in 2015. If you look at the early planting date, the left column there, that reduced yield a bit. And the best yields there were 111 and the 115 with the early planting date. When you got into the later planting date, middle of May, the 95 and 97 hybrid were similar, and then we reduced yield again. In 2016, we top off in the middle part of the graph here at 95 to 105-day hybrids, 111, and the early planting did the same, and we started dropping off. So that drop off in both of the years so far was pretty similar at Clay Center. What about, you know, the advantage of those early season hybrids is being able to plant cover crops earlier. So we essentially designed it so that we could plant cover crops on the date when those hybrids reached about 18% harvest maturity. So we were watching the maturity on the corn hybrids, the different corn hybrids, and then planting the cover crops based on when they reached 18%. That was simulating harvest maturity. So on the 2nd of October 2015, we were able to, the 80, 86, and the 92-day hybrid were ready to harvest. And on the 9th of October, the 95-day hybrid was ready to harvest, and so forth. On 21st of October, we finally were able, the 111 and 115-day hybrid finally got to 18%, and we were able to simulate seeding of cover crops behind it. So these, the blue bars here show you the range in cover crop biomass, and that was the first week in December in 2015. It's a beautiful year for cover crops in terms of establishment. We still had green biomass there in early December. There it is there, the 8th. But we had just short of 1,000 pounds in that first planting date, and it drops down to hardly any in that last planting date. The big bars here are the spring biomass, and that was on the 14th of April, right before termination. About 3 tons here, dropping down to about 1.5 tons there. So there's a trade-off. Less biomass with that later maturing, but the later maturing hybrid didn't always produce the most yields. Here's the biomass from 2016 at the same location there at Clay Center. And the planting date was significant there, but the block you don't have to worry about. At this point, we only have the fall biomass. We will be out there in a few weeks doing the rest of it. The scale is different here. There's 1,000 pounds up there, so we're talking about 700 pounds with that early seeding date for the 80, 86, and 92-day hybrids. 30th of September, we're able to go up to 99-day hybrid and the different planting dates, and you can see that as we planted later, it just makes sense. You have less heat unit accumulation. Rye, cereal rye is what we're using here. It's driven by heat, just like corn is. There's some photos of from in October 2nd. This was 2015. This was the October 2nd seeding date, and that's the October 21 seeding date, and that's what they looked like in the spring of last year. So this is Havelock this year. I don't have too much information on that. I think you've got it. Havelock is dryland, non-irrigated. So in terms of the results from this year, the planting date by relative maturity again was significant. And you see some similar trends. Yield for the early seeding date, 92, 95, 99, 105, and 111 yielded the same with the early seeding date. And in terms of the later seeding date, the 95-day hybrid did better. So we're getting that nice mountain type effect on the data, which surprised us a bit. So some preliminary conclusions, and Nathan and I are able to address questions here, but I've got another slide that's not in there that you want to see. Shorter season hybrids, 95 and 105 compared to 111 or higher, may allow for earlier corn harvest and cover crop planting without affecting yield that much, which was encouraging. And the earlier seeding date obviously increases cover crop biomass. The 88 and 86-day hybrids results in more biomass, but you recognize you have a downside in terms of corn yields based on our studies. And with irrigation, the early planting is more important, especially with the late maturing hybrids. That's just a side effect of our study. Late planting affected yield negatively in the dryland location at Havelock. We'll also be doing the same study at Havelock again this year, so we'll have that data coming in, and we can talk about that next year. Corby Jensen works with Monsanto as well and provided this kind of a summary for us, thinking about, and this isn't in your charts because it came in later yesterday, but work with your seed company. And Nathan, we haven't talked about this, but we can talk about it here in a minute if you'd like, but work with your seed company agronomist for recommendations. You know, when you're pulling down an 80-day hybrid out of North Dakota, is it, Nathan? I mean, you don't have the disease tolerance. You don't have the adaptation to drought and heat that we have here. So consult with them very closely. You're moving that, and it's disease tolerance you have to worry about too. GLS and some other things, southern rust aren't as problems up there. And think about row width too. You know, those hybrids have shorter stature and less leaf area, and there's, you know, so that canopy is open longer. So it may allow you some aerial seeding. We haven't looked at that, but you know, your broadcast aerial seeding to give them an advantage. And drought tolerance is something you really need to be concerned about as you do that. So as you think about this, and Nathan can come up and join me here. Might be good if you had another mic, Nathan, but all right. But the thing that you know, our group is thinking about, if you think, you know, corn breeding, I've studied a lot the history of corn and corn breeding over the years. And as you think about the way we've been selecting and breeding for corn for high yield environments, 30-inch rows, high populations, and that directly opposes some of the concepts of trying to get cover crops established. That's why this is a tough thing to study. But we've been breeding really for environments for sole crops. So if we start breeding for crops or start thinking about management like you did, Nathan, and managing for not only the sole crop but also for the cover crop, how would the plant look differently? How would our management look differently? And that's some of the direction that I've been thinking here. So, will the architecture of corn, should we start breeding for different leaf angles, different populations, different row spacing? So what questions do you have for us? What ideas came up as we spoke? We've got several minutes here. What things did you learn?
If you don't ask questions, you're going to bust our plan, because we planned for 15 minutes, for 10, 15 minutes for questions.
And we've got it.
We have it.
What do you know? 2 extension guys that actually...
We stayed on time. That's odd for me.
Yes.
So.
When you talk about early planting dates for corn, are you talking pre-50 degree soil temperature, and on beans pre-60 degree soil temperature?
Where are you at? Oh, there you are. I see you. Well, I would hesitate to plant too much earlier than 50 degree corn temperature. You know, if the soils are 45 and conditions are great and your 5 to 7 day forecast looks wonderful, and if you're in the end of April, I'd plant it. Nathan, you want to follow
on
up?
the soybeans, well, there's 2 answers. There's the crop insurance date and then the actual date you plant, whether you report when you planted. You know, the biggest risk with early season planted beans is probably more of the frost risk, more than the soil temperature per se. Actually, the 60 degree mark is a recommendation, but you can actually have germination lower. On a lot lower on soybeans. You can have soybeans germinate 50 degrees, but the main risk is the increased stress you get on that plant because it's slower emerging and germinating, and then the frost risk. So I guess I would still lean towards the same things Roger said, take into account where you're at and what the forecast looks like.
But you know, I've seen frost on corn. I'll get to you in a minute, Ray. Frost and corn side by side with soybeans. You know which one often comes through better than...
Yeah, the soybeans look better than the corn, usually. Yep.
You've got a lot more potential for buds in that, you know, surviving buds above ground. Ray, you had a question.
The question is, do you change the population based on maturity?
Did we change the population based on maturity? That's a good question. We did not. Well, we actually had 3 populations embedded in this. So all the hybrids are planted with 3 populations with that in mind. So I'll go back and restate my answer. We did do that, but so far no results that came out of that, no interactions with hybrids in years and the planting dates. Populations do make a difference. No change in row space. We're 30-inch rows.
So those earlier season hybrids, the shorter season hybrids, do we need to plant those in 20-inch rows?
That's the direction we need to go. You know, I think in order to adopt that kind of technology, you've worked with the early season hybrids more than I have, really, Nathan, but canopy closure is a big deal. We don't have the plant height on those hybrids, so higher pops, narrow rows, to me, make sense. You know, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done when we're trying to adapt our management systems to cover crops. The Corn and Soybean Board allowed us to get a start on it, but there's a long ways to go yet. And those are a couple issues. Nathan, were you going to respond?
Yeah, in South Dakota, just because it's been a number of years there is higher or narrow row spacing. 20-inch bean, corn, everything is more common in the farms up there, and where we're dealing with ranges from 85-day to 110-day on maturity. Higher plant populations in the east, but those plants have less leaves and usually a little bit different architecture too. So we've bred for regions like Roger said, and trying to move stuff outside of those regions, we need to look more into that on the data and the research side.
Yeah, Well, that's the other thing I didn't mention. Those 80-day hybrids were bred for the north. So what would happen if we started breeding for 80-day hybrids here? You know, that alone is just a huge possibility.
So this discussion, I'm here, you find me? Okay. This discussion leads me into a promo for the coming weeks, days. The Nebraska On-Farm Research Network will be providing their research updates at 5 locations across Nebraska, and you all have this card in your packets, okay? Dates and times are on there and locations. And we have one grower who's in 15-inch row corn here in eastern Nebraska, and we'll be going over his results.
Good.
And he had rye strips, and he had no rye strips, alternating throughout the field. And the yield was 229 bushels in that 15-inch row corn. That's pretty good, don't you think?
I think so.
For 1 inch of irrigation water in 2016. So we'll go over those results plus other cover crop results.
Yeah.
So now back to you, Roger.
Yes, sir. Do you have a question,
We've always
sir?
heard that if the corn seedling comes out of the ground and there's weeds surrounding it, that it reacts adversely to that competition. What's the difference between those weed seedlings and maybe rye that's still there?
Corn's not colorblind. It sees green. And it doesn't know that that rye is a good thing. In fact, it sees it as a negative. How's that? It doesn't literally see it, but light reflection from a green canopy at emergence will affect the way that corn plant grows. So the corn would see that as a negative to have green material on the surface of the ground when it emerges. Nathan, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I would just say that is my same understanding true, but there's a lot of growing season left, and that may not be the limiting factor at the end of the year.
Yeah.
So it can have a negative impact, but other things may be more important. It just depends. So it's everything in the whole growing season adds up together. So, but what Roger said, yeah, that's
you
what we
can
understand.
simulate that same effect by just putting something green down on the ground. It doesn't change soil temperatures. I've done that. It's not very pretty. But you're right. It could be just a tiny element that distracts the corn, but the long-term environment may overcome that very easily. What it does is changes the leaf orientation on the plant. I can go through that if you want.
Just thinking here. My turn.
It's your turn.
Thinking here, if we talk about raindrops hitting the soil and splattering up the pathogens off the soil on the corn plant. So
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
you got a cover crop that's not going to splatter things.
Right.
So that'd be a trade-off with the green versus green in the canopy.
Yeah, that's right. The residue, this man was saying, has often got pathogens in it, and by having the green cover on there, it could limit rain splash from the residue up to the leaves.
You can't just see what pathogens splatter up off the soil on the plant.
Yeah, it makes
Right off of the drawing blank.
that makes some sense. There are some diseases that would do that. GLS comes off the plant like
Bare
that.
soil versus cover crop soil.
Right, bare versus cover crop with residue. Having that residue there with that pathogen on it could be a problem.
What was that question?
The question was, I tried to summarize that, but the residue or clean soil there, residue with pathogens on it may end up with a splash of those pathogens up to the seedlings, whereas if you had rye there, something else that may reduce that. And I think that's a valid point. Question there.
I'll say this tongue in cheek, it isn't a question. But one of the things I really love about cover crops is finding out how well my co-op can spray. And most of the time it's not suitable.
And I think you all
We'll move on.
Sometimes we learn more about that screw us than if we pick everything right.
Yeah.
Other questions for Nathan and Roger?
Along that same lineup with disease, are there any diseases rye would carry into a corn crop?
Are you going for it?
Go ahead.
I'm not sure.
No.
The one thing it does do is change the environment of that canopy. So it may make it more prone to some diseases. I'm not a pathologist. Justin McMecken, are you still here? How would you respond to that, Justin?
So I guess to reiterate my answer, I don't think we have a very good handle on that yet. It's been brought up at a few meetings that we've had, and people have certainly asked about it, but I just don't think we really know what might carry over and what might be a problem in the system. So sorry, it's not a complete answer, but again, more room for research.
There was a study at Iowa State. I don't know if you've seen that one. Justin Allison Robertson went with untreated corn seed. How many of you use untreated corn seed? Well, that was the research protocol, and found that some of the early season, help me out, seedling blights, some of the early season seedling diseases did impact corn when that corn was not, the seed was not treated. So the next step is to take that with treated seed and look at the same thing, and I'm not aware that anybody's done that either. Good questions. Thanks, Justin, too, for pulling in. So question way back there, it looks like Lowell.
Same question, basically applied to insects.
Insects.
Justin.
Justin.
Insects is going to be a different answer. I think Justin will be able to share that.
Yeah, so there are some potential insects that are issues. We get lots of observations across the state. It does vary depending on the cropping history and situation. It's actually research that we just recently got funding for to look at. There are several other published research from other states that indicate potential issues. Yeah, there are a number of potential insects. Lots of them are below ground insects that we typically worry about. Yeah, we'll be conducting that research over the next 3 years here in the state. Also looking at beneficial insects, because that's something that's not being measured in the system, is the opportunity for crab beetles to remove weed seed populations that are present to knock down a weed seed bank. You know, there's a lot of situation, a lot of things that show up when you're trying to consider that. You know, what's the termination date relative to that? You know, and of course cropping history, but cutworms and other things have shown up, wireworms. If anybody's interested in that, feel free to contact me.
Why don't you introduce yourself too, Justin?
Oh, sure. So I'm Justin McMicken. I'm a crop protection and cropping system specialist located here at the Agricultural Research and Development Center. I was just hired in August. My background's really in winter wheat production, so I'm kind of shifting to focus on cover crops. I got a few graduate students that'll be starting this summer, and that's their primary focus, is to gain a handle on the insect or arthropod side of the situation, because I know the questions keep showing up. So,
great. Thanks, Justin.
I have a question.
Quick comment here.
One more question. Then
Ironic here, you ask about insects. Last year, I actually had some wheat stem maggot infest some one corn hybrid, but ironically, the corn hybrid that it infested yielded more than the one that it didn't. But that's the only insect. Wayne Onus Oregon, I did some research out there.
Okay.
That's the fun thing about being an agronomist. You get to continue being wrong your whole career. And my wife always asks me, how come you haven't figured this all out yet? I said, I blame the past generation, and the next generation will blame me for not understanding everything yet.
Well, Keith, I assume we're out of
I
time.
saw somebody had a question.
I got a question here that I've been using wheat for a number of years, but I've been told that I forget what the word is, but the toxins that can be out there that can influence a seedling from rye. Does rye produce that and then hold back the corn a little bit? Is wheat less? How could you address that? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, well,
like the comparison might be what pennycress does to a field, and then if you have a severe infestation.
We're talking the allelopathic effect.
There you go. I always forget that word.
There's literature that suggests that, but a lot of people are still concerned whether that is actually happening or not. So times you can see that, you know, you can see some repression of weeds after rye, for instance. So far, we haven't seen any impact on our corn or soybean growth and development. We're watching that closely, following rye. So in our studies, we haven't seen anything. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, we just haven't seen it.
Just a real quick comment. My PhD research at K-State was looking at when to terminate winter annual weeds. So I had fields all over eastern Kansas where we had nice cover crop equivalents worth of henbit and field pennycress when we looked at termination date. One of the largest drivers in that was both water and nitrogen, and then there was still a portion of that yield drag that was unexplained. So, but nitrogen was a component, meaning you kill the winter annual weed thick stand in the fall or early spring versus killing the winter annual weeds after the corn was come up. We gained some of that yield back by putting 30 pounds of nitrogen because we had N rates on top. We gained some of that yield back by putting extra 30 pounds of nitrogen when we terminated those winter annual weeds late. So I wouldn't, if people have questions on how winter annual weeds act as cover crops, I have other observations from 3 years of work on that too. You can talk to me later.
Just curious, did your study just look at how cover crops affect yields, or did you challenge that with a cost per bushel? Realizing, you could take maybe a little less yield for the benefit the cover crop provides.
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now we're only looking at yield. We have an economist on the project that once we get the 2 and 3 year data summarized, that's going to be his position to look at all the inputs and the costs, because there's a trade-off. Some years in the large studies supported by the corn and soybean checkoff, there are yield reductions. It's usually neutral, but sometimes there are some reductions. So we're going to look at all the economics of that. So that's down the road. Give us another year for that.
Another economic component of this early and full season maturities is if you've got sizable corn acres to harvest and you can start harvesting in August some years, that might be to your advantage versus having it all come ready to harvest in October. Okay. And the other point is if the grain industry is looking for new corn, which isn't the case right now, but that does happen, and you've got new corn in August, could be a significant premium for that as well. So there's a lot of other factors involved.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Roger and Nathan. Give them a big hand. Great questions, folks.